So James,
So, good morning. My name is Jim Wayman. I'm the president of KIPEC, the Korea Interparliamentary Exchange Center. Today's roundtable is titled Adapting the ROK U.S. Security Alliance in a Changing Security Environment, which is certainly what we have these days. We are joined by two highly qualified experts. First, on the left, we have Amy Searight, who is a senior advisor at the consulting firm Vriens Partners. She holds a PhD in political science and an MA in East Asian Studies from Stanford and graduated magna cum laude from Williams College with a BA in political economy. And on the right, we have Benjamin Goldberg, who is a senior affairs analyst at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where he focuses on issues such as Northeast Asian security and diplomacy, regional intelligence coordination and cooperation, and Indo-Pacific geopolitics. He graduated from Haverford with a BA in East Asian Studies and studied abroad at International Christian University in Japan. And moderating it, we have our own Olivia Kim, who has a PhD from Georgetown and is a research fellow here at KIPEC. So, Olivia, over to you.
yeah, thank you. Amy and Ben, thank you so much for your time. So let me jump straight into the question.
Sure.
For Amy. So over the past decade, how has U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy evolved in balancing security commitments with economic and trade policy? And what implications does this shift have for South Korea's national interest?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Look forward to the discussion today. I think when we look at the integration of security and economic interests in American strategy, I mean, that has been, there's been strong integration for over a century, since the end of, the early post-war period. There was a real effort to combine economic elements of leadership in the trade regime and financial leadership with security commitments and leading security efforts. In Asia, it's gone quite a ways back, including like a real bipartisan consensus around the idea that both an economic engagement strategy and a security strategy are both fundamentally important and need to be integrated. And we've seen that, just stepping back a little bit, just thinking historically, I mean, President Clinton elevated the young Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC, into a leaders meeting, followed by President Bush, who for 8 years of his presidential administration, every year he had a perfect attendance record for APEC, leading into negotiations of free trade agreements, again under Clinton and Bush, with Singapore, Australia, Korea, and all of this was seen as not just serving our economic interests, but in our broad regional security interests as well. And leading up to President Obama, who launched the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, and I was in the Defense Department working for, at the time, Defense Secretary Ash Carter, when we went to Shangri-La Dialogue, and he, in his speech, said that TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is worth more to me as Defense Secretary than another aircraft carrier. So that was the real message that reflected the real belief of policymakers for a long time on both sides of the aisle, that you needed to have an economic engagement strategy, perhaps especially in Asia, to support a security strategy. That started to unwind about a decade ago, almost a decade ago, during the 2016 presidential campaign, when both parties, both President-elect Trump and Secretary Clinton, came out against TPP, and the United States started to really back away from leadership on the trade side. We saw President Biden try to sort of create this IPEF, this Indo-Pacific economic framework, to try to build some economic engagement back in to what was a real regional strategy. That was relatively weak tea compared to what the United States used to do, but it was better than nothing. We also saw, beginning in the first Trump administration, and based on real bipartisan congressional support, an attempt to get to play a larger role in infrastructure development in the region, with the BUILD Act in Congress, and the launching of the Development Finance Corporation, the DFC. But those again are welcome steps, better than not doing them, but they don't amount to the same kind of thing that
Right.
we used to have,
Yeah.
which was
Yeah.
real leadership in trade.
Yeah.
But what we've seen with this second Trump administration, with the use, the imposition of very high tariffs and using tariffs very transactionally
Right.
to bargain very hard for specific economic and political goals, that's a big disjuncture from the past. And it has all kinds of implications, I think. I think it really does undercut our strategic goals
Yeah.
in many ways. And it's a big change from before. Stepping back just for a minute, looking at the security side,
Yeah.
again, we've seen long continuity of and bipartisan consensus around a growing recognition that the Indo-Pacific is fundamentally important, perhaps the most important region for our long-term strategic interests. With Obama launched the rebalance or pivot to Asia, that was carried through the next several administrations. We've seen an increasing focus on China as a long-term strategic challenge for the United States and for our partners in the region, and a move away from
Yeah.
the hub and spokes alliance system to a more networked approach, trying to create real networked
Interesting.
partnerships for security.
Yeah.
So the question is, will this current Trump administration continue those kinds of priorities
Yeah.
and that evolution? And I think there are certainly early signals that there is a continuing focus on Asia
Yeah.
in many ways, and China is a strategic competitor. Secretary Hegseth went to Shangri-La and gave a speech that was very much in line with what other secretaries of defense have done in recent years. But a couple things are clear. Well, we haven't yet seen what's not clear is we have not yet seen their strategic documents, the
Right.
National Security
Yeah.
Strategy and the National Defense Strategy. So we don't know how they're really going to define the Indo-Pacific as a strategic priority in relation to other regions and issues. There may be more of a shift to elevating the Western Hemisphere, as we've seen in the attacks on boats and around Venezuela. So we'll have to wait and see how that shakes out. The other thing that is clear is that there's much less interest in multilateralism on the security side with the Trump administration, and so a little bit of a reversion to thinking very bilaterally about alliances, and in line with the tariff discussion, much more of a transactional kind of short-term focus on security commitments. So in terms of Korea's interests, I mean, I'm not going to define Korea's national interests
Sure.
for Korea, but in terms of observing Korea and its strategic response,
Yeah.
I think we can see two things, and I think we're likely to continue seeing Korea move on two fronts. One is to continue to try to strengthen the alliance, the U.S.-Korea alliance, to increase its strategic relevance by strengthening defense capabilities of the alliance and moving towards more flexibility. But at the same time, I think the recent moves in the Trump administration, some of these discontinuities, has prompted Korea and other allies to begin to hedge a little bit and to diversify other economic ties, but security ties as well, and deepen efforts to create more autonomy in defense capabilities.
I think that was an excellent overview of how U.S. strategy is evolving and changing throughout the history, actually. So now kind of we talked about the U.S. side, but I want to talk about the other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So we are seeing some South Asian governments diversify, as you mentioned, their security and economic partnerships, with some countries even tilting more towards China. So how significant is this shift, and how can South Korea and the United States coordinate effectively to sustain influence and support broader stability in the region?
Yeah, I think we are seeing that trend in Southeast Asia. Of course, the shift has been ongoing to a more multipolar world. so that shift has been ongoing, and we've seen middle powers and rising powers like Japan, like Korea, Australia, India, launch serious efforts to create more economic ties and other linkages with Southeast Asia specifically. And in Southeast Asia, we see an embrace of that. I think with the current Trump administration, and especially with the tariffs being imposed by the United States, that has turbocharged those efforts of Southeast Asian nations to really seek to diversify, especially their economic partnerships, when the United States is looking less and less like a reliable trade partner, an economic partner. So, we've seen an intensified interest in negotiating FTAs intra-regionally. Of course, in recent years, we've seen the RCEP and some ASEAN Plus efforts for ASEAN Plus efforts for FTAs and other arrangements. But we've also seen a lot of interest in negotiating FTAs with the European Union or Great Britain, and again, some of these other regional partners as well. And of course, on the security side as well, we've seen a growing interest in Southeast Asia in diversifying their security partnerships with some of these other countries, Japan, Korea, very importantly, Australia, and the EU. But as you mentioned, at the same time, they've certainly been boosting their economic ties and diplomatic linkages with China. All countries in the region have been very interested in increasing their economic engagement with China because of the many benefits that brings. On the security side, it's more mixed. The United States remains a security partner of choice for many, many countries in the region, and a lot of the efforts to create some security cooperation with China are still pretty nascent for many countries and not yet very meaningful. But for some countries, they are increasingly important and meaningful. In particular, Cambodia. We've seen a lot of security cooperation and building of security infrastructure that is that benefits China as well as Korea, as well as Cambodia. Laos is very much under Chinese influence, and there's growing concerns about Thailand as well. Not that it's Thailand is a treaty ally of the United States. We still have a strong security relationship with the United States, but there is clearly growing closeness at the political and even security level with Thailand and China compared to the past. So there is a tilt, but more on the economic side. Korea is an interesting country actually because its foreign direct investment in many of the mainland countries, the Mekong countries, especially Vietnam, but also Cambodia and Laos, has been very significant, and in many ways Korea is the closest economic partner from the at least closest regional economic partner for these countries. And on the defense side, when I was working in the Pentagon and talking a lot to Vietnamese and Indian defense officials, this was a decade ago, but they would always tell us how much they loved working with Korea on defense equipment acquisition. They saw Korea as a very great partner to work with because of the value of the equipment. And so now that, is that an area where the United States and Korea can work together? It's complicated because there are certainly some competitive elements of defense equipment sales between the United States and Korea. However, it's certainly preferable to have Korea be a rising security partner and defense equipment supplier compared to Russia, for example, which are very close partners with the two countries I just mentioned, Vietnam and India, and of course, China as well. So that's an interesting area to consider. But in terms of other kinds of coordination, I think the two countries are going to coordinate where their interests coincide. And there are in my view, there are a lot of areas where we have shared interests and where we could do more. In the Trump administration's view, I think those areas are more limited. For example, from my perspective, it would be great if the United States could work with Korea, both joining the the CPTPP, for example, to build a real contemporary, effective trade framework for regional and broader economic integration. I wish we were doing more of those kinds of initiatives. That's not on the table right now, but there are plenty of other areas where we can work. I mean, just the work we do in the alliance in terms of creating deterrence that promotes regional stability is in of itself a very important role for the alliance and a powerful signal that it sends to the region.
So it sounds like a lot is going on right now, right?
Yeah.
Like not just the U.S., but like other players are like
Yes.
now like changing, trying to adapt in this dynamic
Yeah.
situation. So as the Indo-Pacific security architecture evolves, how should the ROK-U.S. alliance adapt and expand its role? And how do rising U.S. expectations for burden sharing fits into that picture?
Yeah, on the burden sharing question first, Korea is spending, I believe, about 2.85% of its GDP on defense spending, which ranks Korea among the highest of U.S. major allies, really right behind the UK in terms of major allies and their defense spending. Well above the 2% threshold that for a long time was the standard that the United States put forward for NATO and Japan and other allies. So in that regard, Korea's is the burden sharing issue should be less of a problem for Korea. However, we have seen reports that the Trump administration has been pressing Korea to spend, 3.8% of GDP, and they've also there's also reports that they've been trying to put forward a 5% standard, which is much higher. There's also the question of host nation support, the special the security the SMA, the security measures special measures arrangement, which covers host nation support. Was negotiated in the last administration. It's supposed to be effective till 2030. It sounds like the Trump administration may want to reopen that set of questions. I don't really know what they are planning to do and how forceful they will be in making those demands, but I think it does, raise the question of how, and more broadly, I think we should be thinking about how to adapt and increase the relevance of the alliance, how to expand it. And I think we're doing that in a variety of ways, and we certainly can do more to expand the focus of the alliance beyond just the Korean Peninsula, while maintaining very strong combined defense capabilities and deterrence on the peninsula, expand beyond to look at the broader regional stability and deterrence for the Indo-Pacific region. And Korea, for its part, well, I should say first, part of that move does include, I think, continuing on conditions-based operational control transfer to Korea, which will create more, I think, stronger deterrence capabilities for the peninsula ultimately, and will also create more flexibility and broader deterrence for the region. So I think that's a path we should continue to pursue. But Korea, for its part, I think it's already adopted an Indo-Pacific strategic perspective or framework, and I think it should, that's a very positive development, and that's very important for the way the security architecture is evolving. Again, when I was in the Defense Department a decade ago, one of the things we worked on, I worked on trilaterals, including the U.S., Korea, Japan trilateral, and we launched a conversation, I would call it, an exploratory discussion with Korea and Australia to see if there was interest, mutual interest, and ideas for perhaps creating that kind of a trilateral framework. And at the time, it was premature, and I think it was, Korea was not yet ready. This is going back again over a decade. Korea wasn't quite ready to think about really actively engaging on security activities that would be off the peninsula with a partner like Australia. But I think we've seen a tremendous movement in that direction, which I think is very positive and really does increase the strategic relevance of Korea as it becomes more enmeshed in the again networked security architecture.
So I think that was an excellent, comprehensive view of what's happening in the region, actually. So now I'd like to turn to Ben to discuss how these larger shifts are playing out for South Korea at the working level. So from the U.S. perspective, how are ROK Japan and ROK China relations evolving at the working level? And what underlying concerns or uncertainties does Washington see, and how might these dynamics shape future alliance coordination?
Well, first, thank you very much for hosting me, and I appreciate the chance to be here. I should also make very clear that anything I say or comment on is my own opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government in any way, or reflecting the current administration.
Yeah, we make that very clear.
Thank you, yeah. So, it's hard for me to follow up Amy's really brilliant comments about the whole region and its security structure. But speaking sort of more granular, as you mentioned, I think that Washington is paying very close attention to the ROK-China relationship. And I think, especially under the Trump administration, we've seen a larger focus on the issue of economics and trade and investment. Obviously, South Korea and China have a very intense and strong trade, investment, economic relationship, and we understand that. But we also are increasingly concerned, might be a strong word, but paying very close attention to high-tech technology transfer, especially in the area of semiconductors, and Korean investment and Chinese efforts to, well, the polite term is reverse engineer, the less polite term is steal intellectual property from Korean companies, which are, if not the most advanced in the world, among the most advanced in the world in a lot of these, as I mentioned, semiconductors and other high-tech sectors. So I think that the October meetings in Korea between China and President Lee were very positive. I think the relationship is pretty stable right now, and I think we appreciate that as a source of stability, and we don't want relations between Beijing and Seoul to be poor. But I do think we are we pay very close attention to how close they are and the level of strategic coordination and discussion that go on. Conversely, the ROK-Japan relationship, although their meeting, Prime Minister Takaichi's meeting with President Lee in Korea in October went very positively, there are recent tensions, as we know, in the military working level over lingering irritants and territory and exchanges. Obviously, both sides, as very healthy, functioning, strong democracies, have domestic political factors that they have to pay attention to, and we try to keep track of that as well. But even though, as Amy made clear, we are moving more towards bilateral cooperation and less of a focus on, under this administration, interlinked multilateral security coordination, we do very, very strongly still support, especially the U.S.-Japan ROK, or I should say here, Korea, U.S., Japan trilateral coordination. And we do hope that the two sides can continue the strong trilateral coordination and build up their own bilateral defense and security cooperation in a variety of areas. So to be blunt, we are a little disappointed by the recent tensions caused by issues on both sides that I don't need to get into. And we hope they can be resolved. So I think that also mentions some of the concerns and uncertainties. In terms of future alliance coordination, Amy said this very well, so I don't want to repeat, but the U.S. ROK alliance is one of the pillars of our Indo-Pacific policy, and we do seek to make it more flexible and maybe even more broad in terms of not solely focusing overwhelmingly on the peninsula and the DMZ and North Korea solely, but try to expand it to boost deterrence and cooperation with partners, like-minded partners in the region, in a more broad way. Because Korea is, Korea is a strong middle power in the region and maybe in the world. I'm trying to remember, it's 7th largest defense budget this year, maybe. I might be off on that, but very high. A major, as Amy mentioned this as well, defense equipment exporter. A strong trade partner for the U.S. in the region. And I think Korea has a lot of capabilities that would be very, very helpful in trying to maintain stability and a strong deterrence in the region to maintain peace and stability.
I think that your insight was really interesting because actually like what's kind of happening and how things are perceived at the working level. So speaking of this expanding, the Indo-Pacific and how Korea's evolving role is gonna, impact that. So the discussions on Taiwan factor is increasingly, prominent in DC circles right now. And from the U.S. perspective, what does Washington see as South Korea's equities or stakes in the Taiwan Strait, particularly in the event of the military conflict? And how do these perceived stakes shape U.S. expectations about Seoul's potential role?
Well, that's a very sensitive and delicate question.
Yeah.
We're seeing right now between China and Japan how Taiwan issues can become very, very tense and rapidly cause a deterioration in bilateral relations. So we certainly understand the sensitivity and necessity to be very calm and measured in any comments anyone might make on this issue. That said, I think it has to be made clear that the extremely rapid rise of China over the last 2 decades, both militarily and economically and diplomatically, which Amy mentioned, has sort of made China a larger issue, relatively speaking, in the region. And to be completely blunt, North Korea maybe somewhat less of a issue just because of the relative weight of China. We would 100%, as the US government says over and over, want to see a peaceful resolution of the issues between People's Republic and Taiwan. And I think, as Amy said, the main way to try to do that is maintain a strong deterrence, not just with the US, but also with our like-minded partners. And again, to be a little blunt, I think if the worst case scenario happened and there was some sort of Taiwan contingency, whether a blockade or PRC actions on the smaller islands, or any sort of tensions between China and Taiwan, as a US ally, Korea might be asked to do something. Now, I in no way am saying, direct military involvement, but if you just look at the factual balance of power over the last few decades between China's rising ability and the relative decrease of the US's military capability and Taiwan's, I think Korea might be asked, if, again, the worst case scenario happened, to provide support. Now, of course, support is a very vague term. What does that mean? South Korea has an excellent Navy and Army. They have excellent medical facilities. They have strong logistics, a strong commercial fleet. And I think, to be blunt, I think Korea has its own interest in maintaining stability and deterrence in the region. I don't know if these statistics are accurate or updated, but I believe that some 30% of Korean trade goes through the Taiwan Straits. Check me on that. And I think something like 85 to 90% goes through the South China Sea, which would of course be, a primary area of competition. So, I mean, Korea has its own interest in making sure that there is stability, deterrence, especially given Korea's massive imports of, energy and raw materials, food, that it would need, that it does need, and that might be impacted by any sort of crisis in the Straits. So, again, I'm not specifically saying anything in particular, but I would hope that Korean policymakers and experts would be aware that, again, in a worst case scenario with China, the US would probably expect more of a role Korea to play for its own interests to guarantee its own economic and security well-being. So, and I think that ability to play a larger role also dovetails with Korea's own interests in, say, the Yellow Sea or the EC, Sea of Japan, the water, that it also needs to maintain its own sovereignty and security.
So I think it's such a sensitive issue, right? In the States or even in Korea. But I think that your comments was insightful and has some things to consider, like from Koreans. And so I want to switch gear here a little bit. South Korea is exploring deeper participation in regional groupings such as Quad Plus, AUKUS Plus, IP4, and CPTPP. How seriously does the U.S. view these possibilities, and what benchmarks would signal meaningful Korea commitment?
Yeah, that's an excellent question as well. And again, to be somewhat blunt, I do think that, as Amy mentioned, this administration is less focused, interested, paying attention to multilateral groupings such as the ones you mentioned, and the sort of more bilateral alliances, bilateral relationships, bilateral economic negotiations that we've seen. That said, it's very hard. One must say that stronger Korean participation in any of these organizations would undoubtedly benefit the rules-based order and the liberal sort of democratic free trade principles that we've been fighting for throughout the whole post-war period. And so it would definitely be supportive of increased Korean participation in almost any of these gatherings. I mean, they're all a little different, though.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, a little different. So the Quad is not so security focused, and it does include, as we know, Japan, Australia, the United States, and India. I think it would be difficult for South Korea to fully join the Quad, given the difficulties and logistical problems of just having 4 countries have expanded cooperation, and adding a 5th with its own interests and specific desires would be hard. But I think there's absolutely very strong support for Korea to take part in, Quad exercises, humanitarian aid and disaster relief practice or efforts, discussions on maritime security and maritime awareness. And I think Korea would have a great deal to add to the Quad specifically. Though it must also be said that many in Beijing see the Quad as very specifically aimed at China. And so I think Korea might feel a little less eager to be seen as part of that grouping, though we very strongly insist that the Quad is not aimed at China, it's aimed at regional stability. So that's sort of one issue. AUKUS Plus, obviously AUKUS has a very specific goal at base, nuclear submarines for Australia. So I think becoming part of that specific project would be difficult for Korea given all the other issues it's facing. But of course, Plus includes some of the working groups on issues that I think Korea would have a lot to add to. Areas of high-tech, quantum computing, hypersonics, a lot of these high-tech research areas that I know Korean companies and researchers would undoubtedly be able to contribute to. So being personally, I think that would be great. But again, there are difficulties and organizational challenges. In terms of IP4, which is the NATO plus 4 Asian allies, which is Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia, as far as I know, Korea is already playing a strong role as one of the 4 in the IP plus 4 structure. And speaking a little off the cuff to something I'm sure your audience already knows, Korea is already playing a very major role in defense equipment exports in cooperation with Eastern Europe, Poland, other NATO members that already have a strong relationship with Seoul in both the defense and sort of military equipment sector. So in terms of IP plus 4, I think Korea is already part of that very strongly. And Amy talked about CPTPP, so I'll just add that the U.S. is not part of CPTPP. We are not planning to apply for membership, but I do think that the CPTPP would be stronger with South Korea, obviously a major economy. I think CPTPP is an excellent way to maintain some of the investment and trade rules in the region that I think we all mostly support. I know for the CPTPP, it has a very difficult accession process because of the very strong and complicated rules regarding investment, trade, subsidies. So for example, they just held their meeting, and I think the next country they seek to have joined is Costa Rica, which is important, but I mean, obviously not as economically powerful as South Korea. That said, I do think the leading CPTPP members, Japan, Australia, Canada, Mexico, would welcome, at some point, South Korea's accession to CPTPP, and I don't see how it would hurt U.S. interests in any way. But of course, CPTPP, again, to make clear, is purely economic. It's purely economic. There's no security or defense element of that at all. So I just want to make that very clear.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that was a really nice overview of what these groupings are and how can South Korea contribute or not. So I have a next question. Given the limited U.S. appetite for traditional economic engagement, what does a realistic economic security pillar of the ROK-U.S. alliance look like today? And where can the two countries cooperate most effectively without overpromising?
Yeah. Well, again, under the current administration, I mean, you saw that when the president visited, Korea for the APEC,
Yeah.
When Korea hosted APEC just a month and a half
Yeah.
ago, they signed a very extensive agreement with cooperation in a large number of sectors. I'm sure your audience and everyone here knows more about that than I do, and so I don't need to talk about that. But sort of from a high-level view, I think one issue that this administration is particularly focused on, and increasingly our partners as well, is economic security, which incorporates a lot of different elements. Obviously, economic security can mean different things to different people.
Right.
But from the current perspective in Washington, from what I can tell, economic security means protecting high-tech, production and research, which I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
South Korea, obviously,
You did, yeah.
hugely important for semiconductors and other areas. And also, one area where Korea might be able to do a little bit more is supply chain security.
Yeah.
So obviously during COVID and after, we saw that in terms of production and especially of some raw materials and rare earths,
Yeah.
China has a large role in these areas, which, given the possibility of tensions or competition between U.S. and China, there's some concern over, whether those supplies would be continued. And of course, Korea knows better than me the experience with urea, with the experience with other, trade restrictions. We saw it. I mean, economic coercion is a loaded term, but we saw China try to coerce Japan into certain behavior. We saw with the Philippines and their banana exports of Taiwan and pineapples. Obviously, there are examples of China using its economic power in ways that might be seen as somewhat, provocative.
Right.
And so I think, given Korea's massive overseas economic presence, its huge investment, especially I think Amy mentioned Southeast Asia, Vietnam, there are ways in which Korean companies might be able to do more to guarantee a more diverse and extensive ability to supply some of the raw materials that the modern economy is increasingly, again, very dependent on.
Right.
I have no detailed knowledge of how much cobalt you need or how much, tungsten LG needs, but obviously these are issues that we all have to think about increasingly. So those are two areas where I think are useful. One more thing I would add is, in the worst case scenario of economic coercion, I think it would be helpful for Korea, as with our other like-minded partners and allies, I'm not singling out Korea, to maybe support some of the countries who might be suffering if China decides to take more sort of stronger action in response to other countries' activities. For instance, a very small example, but Lithuania had exports and imports with China hurt by its decision to, I think, open a Taiwan representative office, which, China views as provocative. I think we don't see it that way. And obviously, especially for smaller countries, smaller economies, a country which is much more economically powerful like Korea could maybe do more to support these countries. That's just a thought. I'm not specifically recommending any sort of policy, but I do think there are discussions increasingly among our government and our allies to sort of find ways to mutually support countries that are facing some of this economic pressure.
Right. Yeah.
And I'd probably gone into a little too much detail there, but there is room for cooperation here.
That's really interesting because I'm interested in economic security a lot actually, and that's kind of giving me the idea of how to expand my own thoughts and even how Korea can play a larger role.
And this is not Korea specific, but for Japan, when China was protesting the Fukushima nuclear disposal issue, which I know is a very sensitive and very difficult issue.
Yes,
they banned Japanese seafood imports, and that had a huge effect on northern Japan's economy. Huge, relatively large.
Koreans weren't too happy about that.
Koreans were not very happy about that either, but in the end, they did remove the ban. But now China's reinstituted the ban. And I know that the U.S. moved quickly in this specific case to try to purchase more of Japan's seafood exports, which sort of gave some support given the collapse of demand from China. So I'm not saying this specific case is a role model, but
Right.
there are examples of trying to support countries that face this sort of economic pressure.
Interesting. That was a really good, like explanation of how to think about like Korea's role in Indo-Pacific region at the working level. So thank you.
And sorry, I just want to add one more thing about the economic pressure because it's more Korea specific. Obviously, this is over almost 10 years ago, but the THAAD issue, again, Korea knows more than I ever will about this issue. And I think that, Korean companies that face difficulties in a huge market, China, given to that, maybe looking with hindsight, which is always 2020, we could have asked our partners in Australia, Japan, elsewhere, to maybe do more to support those Korean companies which are facing such strong, backlash in China. But again, this is very hypothetical at this point.
I think that's just interesting to discuss this. So I have a last question for both of you. So looking ahead to 2026, which is not too far now, right? We're in December now.
Yeah.
So what's one shift the ROK-US alliance must make to remain strategically relevant in a rapidly changing Indo-Pacific environment?
Well, that's a very short time frame. So you're talking about a shift in 4 weeks. But look, I think there are a number of areas where we are expanding and strengthening our alliance that we could build on or intensify. I think Ben just mentioned some really important points about cooperation in defense industrial cooperation and economic security. And even though the United States, to go back to my initial remarks, has become much more transactional and is actually using economic coercion almost as we've long accused China of in terms of threatening tariffs if we don't achieve political ends that we want. We've seen that in the threat of tariffs to Thailand and Cambodia if they don't adhere to the ceasefire that they signed. It's a nice goal, but it's, I think, very problematic when we're using economic coercion to reach it. So I'm not optimistic that the Trump administration will, be very interested in trying to really stigmatize further the use of economic coercion. But it is an area for future work with the OECD and other partners. But I think I would go back to, if there was one area to focus on, I would go back to the point about the importance of expanding the alliance in the broader regional context and integrating it more in this emerging new geometry of security architecture. Even though Trump right now, Trump officials do not seem particularly interested in some aspects of security multilateralism and are bilaterally focused, I think in a hub and spoke system, if you are one spoke in a hub and spoke system, I think it makes you a lot more vulnerable. It makes the alliance a lot more vulnerable because it's only one, focus for that hub and spoke, for that spoke. Whereas if it is transformed even more into a real, if Korea is interlinked into a more network security lattice. There are other sort of metaphors or images we can use, but then it makes it much more integral and therefore relevant to not only the U.S. strategic interests in the region, but other countries' interests as well. It just becomes, much more important. And in particular, I think, as Ben has talked about, the security trilateral with Korea, the United States, and Japan. That really is an incredibly important building block of deterrence for Northeast Asia. The importance of regularly discussing, working towards interoperability, or at least creating a common operating picture in the event of a contingency, whether a peninsula-focused contingency or other kind of regional contingency. It's essential that we work seamlessly together for effective deterrence and for promoting stability in the region, and that makes Korea, the U.S.-Korea alliance, incredibly relevant and important.
Well, Amy stole my top two, which was broader regional role for the alliance and the the trilateral relationship between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo. So I'll just sort of speak more broadly about a third, which is, for most of the post-war period, the U.S.-Korea alliance was very security-focused, Military exercises,
Right.
concern about North Korea, focus on very sort of military-only issues. But I think not only under this Trump administration, but over the last few years, we have seen the growing importance of economic and commercial cooperation. And I don't have any brilliant specific ideas to how to boost that as part of the alliance. But I think we did see, some of the building blocks for that in the October agreement. Shipbuilding cooperation, high tech, not just military, but also commercial cooperation, research cooperation, more and stronger Korean investment in the U.S. to tighten the alliance and tighten relations. So, sort of more broadly, creating a more holistic alliance that includes more of these non-military factors might be a major factor in keeping the alliance even more strategically relevant in this current environment. And I should just add that we have to be careful, because at the same time as we're talking about China and economic issues and commercial issues, we do also have to realize that given North Korea's growing, military cooperation with Russia, as we've seen in Ukraine, and to be completely honest, the massive flow of aid, money, fuel from Russia to North Korea, sadly for us in the U.S. ROK alliance, North Korea is probably stronger now than it has been for many years. Not just in terms of, its resources growing, but also in terms of, military cooperation and research and development assistance with Moscow. And it's very hard to do everything at once, and we have to prioritize. But I think it is important, because North Korea hadn't really come up to this discussion, that we do just remember that there is still this huge threat to the north that, unfortunately, given Russia's assistance, is perhaps more of a threat than it once was a few years ago.
I think that was a good point. Yeah. So, thank you both. Before we, close, I would like to turn to our audience. If you guys have any kind of question. Sure. Yeah.
As the sort of the history expert around the table, I have an observation and a question. The observation is the U.S. has sort of dropped the ball with creating relationships, alliances with the Pacific Islands, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Yap. I was just talking to someone about Yap the other day. And Korea has a historical link very deep to all these little tiny islands, because there were, during the war, there were Korean workers. On Tinian, there were 5,000 Korean workers, and there's even a memorial there to the workers. And all those little islands had comfort women, and they generally were Korean, which was not the case in many of the other places. So we don't know how many Koreans, people with Korean blood, are on places like Palau or Yap, I love that, or Guam or whatever. And so Korea can fill in the gap with some of the relationships in the Pacific, in these tiny little Nauru. I can go on with all these little places, love to visit. And I think the best job in the world is, a lot of it now is U.S. parkland, and there's one guy in the Interior Department, at least there was, who had to visit each one of them and count the birds. What a great job. Anyway, and we're coming up on the December 7th, and the Japanese didn't just bomb Pearl Harbor. They bombed Howland Island, they bombed Wake, they bombed Guam, they bombed Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai. Anyway, so I think there's a big opening for Korea to do some good in the region and fill in where everyone has, the U.S. has withdrawn, and they have interesting historical links. But then, and that folds into my question. Right out of the gate, Prime Minister Takaichi, who I actually knew slightly when she was here working for Congresswoman Schroeder, poked China. She very purposely brought up the Taiwan issue. There's been some tension with Korea, but do you think she's going to go on and poke Korea with something? I don't care. You know, is that next on the agenda, or is she just going to try to?
I can't speak directly to Prime Minister Takeuchi's intentions. As far as the Pacific Islands, let me start with that.
Yeah.
I think Mindy makes a really excellent point. The Pacific Islands are strongly, they are small and poor and under-resourced.
Very much so.
I somewhat argue with the point that the U.S. has left. I wouldn't say
well,
left.
I don't know what we are.
But obviously the growing
Chinese.
economic and presence of China is
Yeah.
to the point that traditionally there was a perception, at least, that we sort of left some of those islands to Australia and some to Japan, and the U.S. maybe didn't pay enough attention. And I think
just
Mindy
in
makes
ordnance clearing.
And I think-
Korea is good, excellent ordnance clearing, and it's
Mindy makes
Solomon
it-
Islands are a mess.
Mindy makes an excellent point that especially in some of these countries which are poor and under strong threat of Chinese, well, threat is a strong word, but under strong Chinese economic influence
Yeah,
at least,
yeah.
that
Well,
Korea
yeah.
could definitely play a larger role in helping us and our like-minded partners sort of maintain, sea lanes, maintain open, transparent government and security policy. So 100% agree with that. And we do all of us, not just, Korea and Japan and the US, but also Japan, Australia, New Zealand, should pay more attention to the Pacific Islands given their geographic, how geographically important they are. As far as Prime Minister Takeuchi personally, I hear your point. I'm not sure that she purposely provoked China. I don't know that for sure. We don't know. She repeated existing Japanese policy, though of course in a way that was somewhat public and overt. I would simply say that given that she is the first female Prime Minister of Japan and a very experienced and strong politician, I do have optimism, maybe, it's my personal opinion, that she will be pragmatic and try to keep relations with Seoul on an even keel. I think it must be recognized that President Yi, although he is from I forget the current name, the Democratic Party, Minchidun, has also done a lot to try to maintain good relations with Tokyo, with the meeting in October and the various measures he's taken to try to keep relations on an even keel at the top level. So I have, again, personal opinion, I have guarded optimism that the two countries who are, not to offend Australia, are two probably most important security partners and economic partners in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, will be able to work together on a lot of these issues. And I think it's vitally important for both of their own interests to do so. Given the strong trade relations, economic relations, investment relations between the two countries, cultural ties, and all the other connections that the two countries have. So maybe I'm too optimistic, I defer to Amy, but
Any questions? If not, I'm gonna close here. So Amy and Ben, thank you very much for your insightful 감사합니다의 perspectives. Today's conversation helped clarify not only the broader shifts taking place across the Indo-Pacific, but also the strategic choices South Korea is facing as it navigates new regional dynamics, evolving U.S. expectations, and the growing importance of economic security in the alliance. And thank you as well to everyone here for joining us. We really appreciate your time and engagement, and we hope today's discussion was helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.